let's go ahead and get started. I'm Krista Seiden, and I'll be your host for today. I'm an analytics advocate here at Google. And today I'm also joined by Jesse Nichols, who's the head of growth at Nest. Jesse, thank you so much for joining us. All right, let's go ahead and dive right in. Let's take a look at our agenda. So today we're going to talk about a few things. First, how are marketers challenged with trying to make sense of all of their data, leading many of them to turn to testing to use that data and improve the customer experience. Second, a critical piece of being successful with your testing efforts is to create a testing framework that is adopted by everyone in your company. And third, we'll hear from Jesse about how his team at Nest has found success with experimentation. With that, let's go ahead and dive right into testing to improve the customer experience. So welcome to the data-rich world, where the old challenge of gathering enough data has been replaced by a new one, making sense of too much data flooding in 24/7 from billions of global users and devices. And this trend is only growing. In fact, every day, Google Analytics processes 500 billion digital moments across devices, moments like page views, app downloads, and other events that are important to your business. In response to this new data-driven world and the problems that have arisen with too much data, many of today's most successful businesses have turned to a new approach, building a culture of optimization. So what is a culture of optimization? Well, it's a growth mindset focused on improving the customer experience across the entire organization. If you're like many other marketing leaders, you've started this cultural shift towards a growth mindset. But you might be challenged with a chicken and egg situation. It takes time, effort, dedicated people to build that successful testing program, and nobody wants to commit resources until they see results, which is hard to deliver if you don't have a good testing framework. So today we're going to walk you through two things that I hope will be useful for you when you're thinking about that testing process. First is creating a basic framework that everyone in your organization can follow. And second is teaching everyone how to test with that framework. So before we move on, though, we'd like to hear from you. Does your company have a documented testing process? So you'll see a poll on your screen right now. Go ahead and interact with that poll and choose one of those answers. Your answers are yes, and everyone uses it, yes, but it isn't used by everyone, it's in progress, or no, or I'm not sure. So I'm going to give you just a minute to go ahead and choose your answer in the poll.
Krista, are we sure we shouldn't put these guys on hold? I heard everybody loved the hold music. Be happy to switch that back on for a moment.
Yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think? Should we put that hold music back on for you while we wait here? Nah. All right, let's go ahead and see what you guys have to say. So it looks like the majority of people, 54.8%, are not sure or are sure that they do not have some kind of a documented testing process. 26.1% say it's in progress. That's awesome. You're getting there. 14.6% say yes, but it isn't used by everyone. And only 4.6% of people say yes, and everyone uses it. So I guess you all are in the right place because we're hopefully going to teach you what that documented testing process might look like and how you can start to use it in your organizations. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into point 2 from our agenda and create a framework and teach everyone to use it. So what you're going to test depends in large part on your business, but how you test is very much the same across industries. So the key to building testing into your culture is to establish a repeatable framework that will help make those apples-to-apples comparison easy. So in this framework today, we have 6 steps, and we're going to go ahead now and look at each step individually. So step number 1 is to start with an insight. So don't just pick random experiments. Start by reviewing your data and analytics and looking for things that are working very well or badly that you can try to replicate or improve. And you can use Google Analytics to uncover insights to figure out what you might want to test. So let's actually go ahead and look at a few examples of that. So on your screen right now, you see a devices report in Google Analytics. And specifically, I'm highlighting conversion goals In this case, we are looking at desktop, tablet, and mobile. And their conversion goals for signing up for trial here vary by device. And you can see that both tablet and mobile are significantly underperforming the average of trial signups here. So as an analyst, that might tell me that perhaps there's an opportunity to go ahead and improve that tablet or mobile sign-up flow, and I might want to think of some tests that I can run there to do that. Next is a browser's report. So similarly, a browser's report will show you your traffic, but by browser type. And in this case, I see that Internet Explorer is significantly underperforming my average here, only 0.42% of trial signups for IE versus many more for other browsers. So that's interesting, but if I go ahead and I click into Internet Explorer, I actually get the browser version report. And here I can see that there are actually 3 versions that are driving down this app's trial signup conversion rate. And I happen to know, because I sit with the business, that version 8 here actually was deprecated from our support a while back. We don't support this version anymore, yet we seem to have a lot of people who are still coming to the site and trying to sign up for a product using IE8. So a few things that I could do here. I could either convince my support teams that we need to go ahead and reestablish support. That might be kind of hard. But I also could maybe try to make it easier or more apparent to the user coming to our site from IE8 that their experience is going to be suboptimal. Maybe I can put some kind of messaging on the site if I know that they're from IE8 to let them know that this is not an optimal experience and they might want to try another browser. Or I could just try to redirect them to a different flow. The final report that I wanted to look at here is dealing with search terms or site search. This is actually a custom report that I built in Google Analytics looking at 3 different steps across a trial signup flow and a final conversion goal. But my primary dimension here is search term. So if your website has a search box on it, it's actually really, really helpful to go ahead and enable search term reporting because that will tell you the actual keywords that users are entering into that search box. So for example, here we see that there are a decent amount of people searching for Google Drive, and of those people, they actually convert at a decent rate. It looks like about 3.5% of people searching for that are going ahead and completing, or of the completions are from that search term. So maybe I might want to do a few things here. I might want to surface Google Drive info higher on my website or make it more easily found. Or I might want to actually target people directly into content for Google Drive. Jesse, do you have some thoughts here?
Yeah, what I particularly like about what you've done here is you set up a goal for each step of the conversion funnel as opposed to just setting up a funnel that ends with the goal. And what's nice about that, and you'll see some of the slides that I've built around this as well, is getting an idea to test it kind of depends on where people are dropping out at the funnel. And again, the funnel report can be great for that, but if you want to segment it or if you want to dive deeper into it, having a goal for every step will make it much clearer like this. So you can see where the bulk of people are coming in and where the bulk of them are dropping off in a nice kind of grid fashion. So you might not want to do this in your primary profile. You might want to make a duplicate view, but excellent technique for really highlighting where people are dropping off.
Totally, and that's exactly why we did it, because we wanted that extra level of granularity at each step. So I think that is a good overview of starting with those insights and using GA to find some areas to optimize. Let's go ahead and move on to step 2, which is developing a hypothesis. So here we want to consider why that element is performing well or performing badly, and what is the experience of the user as they encounter it. So I'm actually going to go ahead and ask you, Jesse, do you have some good examples or thoughts on developing hypotheses?
Sure. This is generally actually the kind of fun or interesting part of testing for me, because you've got some data to ground your insight, but hypotheses generally don't involve a lot of data. They involve brainstorming and human interaction with your website. So I like to put myself in the shoes of the customer. They aren't as familiar with the website as you are, and so you need to really try to imagine all the reasons a user might not take the action that you think is apparent or that you want them to. Something might not stand out to them. There might be too many possible actions competing for their attention, or there might not be a clear enough single action that you want them to take. It could be helpful to ask a few colleagues who aren't as familiar with your website to open it up and try to complete a specific task and then talk to you about it. Or use a service like usertesting.com where you can pay volunteers to try to complete a task and they'll record their experience and their thoughts along the way. But even once you establish what you think is happening, before you start testing, you really need to make sure that your hypotheses are verifiable and falsifiable, meaning that you can tell if they have been made true or false. So there needs to be a really clear signifier that the hypothesis is either working as you thought it was, people aren't clicking this because there are too many things competing for their attention, as opposed to something subjective like people like the way I've set up my page. Well, that you may need to know that, but that would be better for a UX study where you can speak to the user afterwards. You really want to focus on things where they either do or do not take an action so that you can make your test easier to complete and easier to review the results.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. I actually really love your point in particular on having colleagues or yourself go ahead and go through some of those flows. I remember when I joined the G Suite team, which is the funnel that I was talking about earlier, they actually had you in your first couple weeks go ahead and go through that sign-up process and go through the process of implementing Google Apps for your own business and for your own domain. And I learned a lot from that trial sign-up process and from trying to actually onboard my own domain to our systems. It was really difficult, and it gave me a ton of ideas of areas for optimization. So I think that's an awesome point, and I hope that you guys took note of that one. So let's go ahead and move on in our framework. Step number 3 is to come up with lots of ideas. So we want to think about all of the ways that you could test your hypotheses. And you want to be small c creative. You don't want to be afraid of unusual ideas or small ideas. And I like to actually open up ideas to an entire organization and ask for input from everyone involved, either via a poll or an email or some kind of a form where they can submit their ideas. So, for example, back in the G Suite organization, we did a lot of testing. Some of the things that we tested were very, very simple. We tested CTAs. One of the most impactful tests that we ran across that whole website when I was running this program was a CTA test on our free trial button. It used to say start free trial. We tested a bunch of variations, and we came out with a new CTA of get started after it proved over and over again that it increased our trial signups by over 20%. It was a huge gain for the business for such a small change. Jesse, do you have a few examples of some of the test ideas that you guys have tried at Nest?
Yeah, we run tests large and small pretty much all the time. There's at least 1 or 2 tests running. And when we were trying to think of a small test to kind of patch in a slow period, we were looking at our marketing pages for our products, which have a ton of great content about what our products do, the feature benefit offering, value proposition to the customer. They also have videos, and then they have a buy now button that leads to the store where you'll actually check out and buy the product. So we want our customers to engage with our content and learn about it, build some desire before clicking buy now. And there's always a buy now button kind of static up in the upper right corner, even as you scroll of the page. So there's always that kind of escape route once the customer's ready to buy. However, we also had one front and center in the main kind of splash hero banner that started off the page right next to our watch video button. And our hypothesis is that users were having to mentally choose between the 2 calls to action, watch video or buy now. And for those who clicked buy now too early before engaging with the content, they were getting to the product page without really having been fully sold on it. And so we wanted to not split their attention, focus the test on a single video call to action, and see if that drove up qualified clicks to the store page, even if fewer of them, and obviously drive up total page conversion rate. Sure enough, we ran a test that had the buy now button as the original, removed it as the variation, again, only on that hero banner. Video views went up, scroll rates went up, general engagement went up, and almost unbelievably, clicks on the buy now button actually went up in total. We expected them to go down even if more qualified, but that went up and page conversion rate went up. So sometimes it's not just tweaking the calls to action, but figuring out what can you take away from your page to reduce the mental energy your customers need to spend to figure out what to do next.
I think that's such an interesting point. It's a great point, and I've seen it work in many, many cases. Interestingly, I actually ran a test where we took away a trial button. We used to have 3, and we reduced it to 2. and we saw a drop in signups. So I think it's really business dependent, and you guys should definitely try out removing and adding buttons and calls to action and seeing if you can narrow or widen that scope to see how that impacts your businesses.
You don't know until you test.
Exactly. So let's go ahead and move on. We are now on step 4, which is prioritize and do so ruthlessly. So you can't test every idea at once. I know, it's a bummer. I want to test everything, and I want to use all of our traffic to do so, but you have to prioritize. And oftentimes you can start with the simple tests that have big impact to make a lot of progress in your business. So let's go ahead and look at how we can make prioritization collaborative. So once you've collected all of the ideas and test input in a business, you're going to want to set up a meeting with a lot of your key stakeholders and collaborators, but make sure it's a manageable size. So maybe you have a representative from marketing, a representative from sales and eng, and the general people who will be involved in this test. So you have this list of tests that have been submitted or that you've ideated, and now you need to go through them. So you want to look at the pros and cons of each test. You want to look at the test design. Maybe you guys talk through what it would actually look like to go ahead and build this and run it. Maybe it's actually a pretty involved test and it's going to take a lot of time to build, or maybe it's a very simple change for engineering or for your testing tool such as Optimize to make. Number 3 is you want to look at the potential test impact and the relevance to the business. So maybe it's a really small test, but it could have really big impact, or maybe it is more or less relevant to the business in that quarter, or it might make sense in a future quarter. Then you want to look at the trade-offs of running one test versus another. And I think this goes a little bit back to test design, especially if you're looking at the impact of how hard or easy it is to build that test. If it's going to take a lot of resources to build it, there are going to be some trade-offs, like you can't run as many other tests that quarter if you have to spend a lot of time and resources to build one particular test. And at the end of that, hopefully you come out with a prioritized list of tests for that quarter, and you're going to want to circulate that with a larger audience to make sure that everybody has buy-in on the objectives and priorities that you guys have set in your small group. Jesse, I'm curious, this is kind of how I've run prioritization in the past, but I'm curious what you guys do at Nest.
Yeah, well, we have a slightly different process that I'll go into much more detail a little later. But basically, we focus a lot of time on weighing the potential upside of a test. You know, we'll look at the ratio that we're trying to impact, and even if we doubled or quadrupled that ratio, how much potential either revenue impact or metric impact could we even see were we to get this monumental success? So we look at the max potential upsides, maybe a little t-shirt sizing of the small, medium, large upside, and then we also consider the fact that by working on that test, we will delay or not be able to work on other tests. So we try to make sure they all kind of have a fair seat at the table. And then one other important thing that I like to make sure our engineers and our designers consider is what we will have learned if a test fails. If we can't clearly articulate what action or lesson we'll bake in based on any possible outcome of the variations, either our variations win, our variations lose, or it's inconclusive, which can sometimes be instructive as well, then it loses some priority points. And some small tests that have a minor impact will be prioritized if it'll teach us something really fundamental about our users.
Yeah, Jesse, I think those are really good points, especially around failing and especially around ensuring that you guys understand what you're going to do with the outcome of that test. In fact, I actually ran a test once. A few slides earlier, I showed you some calls to action, and the other side of that was some headlines that we looked at testing. And one of those headlines, our headline used to say, "Discover a better way of working," which marketing loved because we were selling a suite of tools, including Google Docs and Drive and spreadsheets to businesses, and they thought that it was a nice way of encapsulating that we could increase your overall work experience. But our engineering team actually said, hey, we see from the data that actually 80% of people who sign up for our product only ever use Gmail. And so let's change that headline to say, get email for your domain. Of course, marketing didn't like this, but they said, all right, it's never going to win. Go ahead and run it. And guess what? It won. And not only did it win, it won big time with over a 20% improvement in trial signups. And so it was actually a pretty big fight between marketing and engineering with me in the middle, trying to figure out what we were going to do with this winning test because we hadn't talked about that earlier in our prioritization process. So one of our outcomes there was make sure, just like you said, to talk about what you're going to do with those results and to have agreement that if there is a winner, that we are going to go ahead and launch it.
Yeah, my marketing team, not quite a similar experience. It was almost the same, but in reverse. Our marketing team was certain that the headline and value proposition they had shopped extensively through surveys among customers and found was going to be the best for our offline marketing would also be the best for our website, hero call to action for a specific product. And we said, that's fine. Go ahead and ship it, but if you don't mind, we're actually going to test backwards because we didn't have quite enough time. So we let them ship the new version. We tested it against the old version, and sure enough, at least for the website, the old version worked. And you know what? They conceded, and they said, we'll go back, and we'll either take another crack at this, or we will let them be different. It's fine.
That's great, and that's another really good example of failing and making good out of that. Let's go ahead and move on to our next step. So step 5, creating a process for rapid testing. So we don't want to let tests drag on for forever. We want to make sure we have that workflow for testing and analyzing and deploying over the course of days or weeks, not months. And a quick example here. So when I was doing a bunch of testing here at Google, we typically would run tests for US pages on about 5% of traffic for our marketing websites. But tests that we're running in Brazil or India or Mexico or pretty much anywhere else in the world typically got a lot less traffic than our US website, and so we'd have to run it on a higher percentage of traffic, maybe even up to a third of all of our traffic. And rather than running for just 2 weeks like most of our US tests, those tests would run for 4 or 6 weeks and sometimes not even validate at that point. So it's definitely something that you need to consider in that prioritization process and understand that tests that are running in smaller locations or lower traffic locations might be more impactful on that overall roadmap for the quarter. And speaking of that roadmap, I think it's really important to go ahead and have a documented roadmap for your organization. So one of the best ways that I've found to do this is to have a single Google spreadsheet that has a bunch of tabs in it, a tab where people can put in their test ideas, a tab where all of the tests that have been prioritized for the quarter are listed out with details, and a tab like this one where you're looking at actually a Gantt chart roadmap for the quarter, where anybody can see visually when the tests are going to run and when they can expect hopefully to have results at the end of that test. One final note here is that when you're doing all of this, you also want to document your test design. So here is a test design template that I use for a lot of my tests. It's got some simple things on here like a launch date, a traffic allocation, a summary of what the test might be, the hypothesis, and really importantly, what your success metrics are and what you agreed upon ahead of time would make this test a success. I also like to throw in screenshots, and so anybody looking at this at any point in the future will know exactly what this test is and what the impact might have been. Jesse, how long do you guys usually run a test at Nest?
Well, knowing when to end a test is as much of a skill as anything else when running a growth team. And generally, just to start, I won't end a test before 2 weeks. I like to get through a little bit of that intra-week seasonality. Weekends can behave different. Mondays can be strong for certain companies. So I like to let it get through 2 full weeks unless we've just got such an obscene amount of data and confidence in our hypothesis that we can curtail it. But after that, I'm looking for 90%. That's a benchmark we've agreed upon internally, if not 95% confidence in my primary metric. In Google Optimize, that metric is called probability to beat the baseline. It means that if you ran a similar test 100 times, you would see that result about that percent of the times. If it's 95%, you should expect to get that kind of result 95 out of 100 times. Pretty high level of confidence. However, if my primary metric is in the 75 to 90% range, that's a good indication it's doing well, but I'll let it keep running to see if it firms up. If it's below 75%, it's basically a coin toss to me. So if we're not reaching 90% in 2 weeks, I'll give it a few more, up to 4, sometimes 8 weeks if it's not a core piece of property or if it's in a geolocation that needs more time. But if it's got well over 10,000 session over 8 weeks and it's just not reaching confidence, it's hovering in that 50 to 70% confidence range, I'll go ahead and end it as inconclusive. I really like to keep our pipeline moving, and I have no problem saying a test was inconclusive and that we need to be a little bit more assertive with the design. The other thing that we'll do to make sure that our testing pipeline is moving quickly is to find streams on the website that can have tests running that won't significantly impact other tests. So we might have one set of tests running on our store pages, one set of tests running on our support pages, another one on our login pages, and there's really minimal chances of overlap. And even if there is some, it should be distributed evenly, and this allows us to focus on other parts of the site while the test is running.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points, and I agree 90%, 95% is a really good baseline to have. So let's go ahead and move on to our last step of the framework, and that is to test small. So when in doubt, keep it simple. You want to test lots of small things incrementally, not necessarily sweeping changes. Of course, there's always a time for that, but I think that you can find a lot of impact by testing small. You'll be surprised, actually, how much difference one small tweak can make. And I want to run you through an example. I actually call this the impact test. So back in my G Suite Google for Work testing days, we ran over the course of a year hundreds of tests, but they were all on significantly small things. So CTAs for our trial button, our contact button, different headlines, some tweaks to our pricing page. And about a year into our testing program, we wanted to quantify the impact of all of these small changes together. And so what we did was we took a copy of the current website, keeping all of the little meta updates and whatnot there, but we turned back in time those things that we had changed. So we turned back the headlines and the CTAs and the pricing page. And we ran a test to see if the current version of the page or the current version of the page with all of those small tweaks turned back did better. And what we found was that over the course of a year, we had about a 30% positive impact when all of these changes were taken together on our bottom line for the business. So a lot of small changes over time having a very, very big impact on the business. So this was a huge success for us. And I think it's a great way, if you guys are looking for a way to quantify the impacts of your testing program, to do something like this, where you are turning back in time several of those small tweaks that you've made to be able to show the overall impact of your testing program. Jesse, what are some of the small changes that you guys have done that you've seen large impact from?
Well, we've had a number of headline and call to action tests that have proved successful. One of the more interesting ones, though, is where you're looking at things on the website that haven't been touched for a long time, old assumptions that might have been relevant in the past but need to be challenged. And one of those is when you're buying our Nest thermostat, you have the ability to check whether it's compatible with your heating system. And when we were a young company, it was much more important to do that check. But our thermostat has become compatible with well over 90% of relevant systems in the US, so it's very uncommon that it's incompatible these days. And to check compatibility, you have to rip your current thermostat off the wall. So it's needless to say, it's a pretty involved process. We have these compatibility checkers all over our site, though, but there was this one legacy decision to put it on the actual cart page after you've added your thermostat to cart. And through my analysis, I noticed that our thermostat had among the lowest cart conversion rates of any of our products, even though it's our flagship. So sure enough, I looked at that link. I said, do we really need this to, our compatibility team? They said, in the US, it should actually be generally okay. So I tested it against removing that link, but I also tested it against putting a link to our return policy, so customers would feel better in case they got it, and it didn't work. And sure enough, we saw a double-digit percentage increase on our flagship product through a very important channel, Nest.com. We obviously sell it in many other places. But that was a phenomenal increase, and we'll be watching return rates from that product to make sure nothing goes haywire, but that was a few months ago, and so far so good. So again, check your old assumptions just to make sure they're still valid.
I love that example and showing how just removing a small little thing can have such a big impact on your business. All right, so that was our 6-step framework. Let's go ahead and do one more poll before we move on with the rest of this webinar. So this poll, the question is, how does your company measure the success of website experimentation? So we'll give you just a minute to go ahead and answer your questions. We'll save you from the horrible hold music, but I'm going to go ahead and read these answers to you. So first option is to increase in revenue or sales, increase in customer acquisition, reduce churn, reduce bounce rate, increase in number of experiments run, or other. So go ahead and put your answers in. All right, let's go ahead and look at what those results are. So for the question, how does your company measure the success of website experimentation? It seems like overwhelmingly you do so in one of two ways. Either it's an increase in revenue or sales, with 32% of you guys answering that way, or an increase in customer acquisition, which is almost 40% of you guys answering that way. Also, other and reduced bounce rate has some decent answers there. Reduced churn and increase in number of experiments run are not really considered by most here. I think that those two are pretty typical when it comes to testing programs for measures of success. I think that's great. And there are probably many other ways that we can also look at measuring success across our website experimentation programs. So let's go ahead and move on, and I want to talk about failing often and learning from those past failures. So what do you do when it looks like the test that is supposed to be a major success actually fails, and how do you learn from those? So I have one example for you. I was working with a marketer who had spent probably about 3 months working with our development teams to build a new landing page for a campaign she was working on. And just before, like the week before this website was supposed to launch, she had completed everything. The dev actually says, hey, why don't we test this against the current landing page? And side note, it was at that point that I knew that our culture of optimization was actually starting to take hold in the business, because if I can get a developer to add me into a conversation and bring up the idea of testing, that was a win for me right there. But let's continue on. So we ended up testing this new landing page, and we actually found after a couple weeks that the new page performed miserably, like so much worse than our old landing page. And thankfully, that marketer was very data-driven, and she was totally bought into our testing program and the idea of testing, that she was the first one to say, okay, we shouldn't launch this new website. I know I just spent 3 months working on it, but if it's going to have that bad of an impact on our business, we definitely don't want to do that. We've learned some things from here. Let's go ahead and rework this website and see if we can take those learnings and create a better landing page. And we went through a new testing and iteration process there. And that was a really big success in my mind, because not only did we prevent the loss of significant revenue from the business, but we also found that within our organization, there was a much better idea of testing and a buy-in to the testing process. Jesse, I know you have some thoughts here as well, so I wanted to turn it over to you to tell us about failing often.
Yeah, the first day that you, especially someone you don't normally work with, get plussed into a conversation saying, hey, this would be a great thing to test, is pretty satisfying, even if you're kind of being used to politically say, I don't think this is going to work. But hey, better to test it and find out and live with the result than to pitch some internal battle when really you should just let the users decide. So that's really satisfying. It's also a really important lesson for the design, marketing, and eng teams to internalize that failure is okay. It's very common to get pushback from any one of these teams because you're seen as wasting time and effort because they have to build the test rather than just building the production-grade solution. And if the test fails, then they've just lost this work. But if there's not an appreciation that the lesson itself is worth the work, then you'll never really advance the testing practice to become something like a culture.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think one thing that we thought about doing quite often is something like a quarterly failure report. And the goal would be to share some of those learnings about the failures. So we launched this marketing landing page. It failed. Here's why, and here's what we're going to do about it. This was a great test because we learned X, Y, Z. And it reinforces that culture of failing and learning fast.
Yeah, I mean, the only true failure is a failure to learn. So, pick up what you can from every test. And again, if you have a great hypothesis, you'll know what you can learn even before the test starts.
Yep, definitely. So, Jesse, I want to turn it over to you now so that you can tell the audience about how Nest found success with testing and experimentation.
Sure. So I wanted to go over first what our growth team looks like, how we came up to have a steady state ongoing optimization team. And, I started there as a web and app analyst, leading up all analytics on digital properties. And that got me a lot of runway. I got a lot of great insights, but I wasn't always able to get those insights acted upon as quickly as I like. And Nest, if you don't know, is a very design-heavy company. Their pages already look good. Their website generally functions the way you would hope a website would function. And they didn't necessarily do a lot of testing on the website. And so they didn't necessarily believe it would work for them. Testing is for people with ugly or bad websites, and these insights are interesting, but how do we know that the customer will actually respond to things differently? So I really had to introduce them to the concept, show them that we could still improve, and show that it would be, I had to convince them that it was unlikely that our designers would have found the exact optimal solution the first time around, that there are many different ways they could have approached a problem. They probably left some good ideas on that cutting floor, and we just need customers to tell us how good of an idea they were. And so we started with a small group of interested players, started with some very small tests, things that we could launch ourselves without much or any dev support, and just kept expanding the scope until now we work with practically every digital team. We have a recognized growth testing practice at the company, and we're getting increasing amounts of resources and prioritization as we grow our credibility and strategic value to teams. So, since I am the primary analyst in on web and activity, I am the source of a lot of the data that tells us where to start testing. We'll, of course, take comments from around the company as well, but I'm able to read through the data to find where the points of friction seem to be, and then also evaluate the size of the business case of removing that friction. Again, you could have a great place to test, but even if you double or triple a metric, you might not really see that much of an impact on the bottom line. So the business case is kind of the gold standard of prioritizing what to test and coming up with, again, a high, medium, low level of impact. But not everyone has access to that level or time for analysis. And really, when in doubt, you have a fairly good intuition about what your website is supposed to do. And you will have the greatest chance at impact if you start right next to your conversion point. So if you're a retailer, if your conversion is a transaction, if you start on the checkout funnel, you will have the highest likelihood of impacting your conversion rate. But the checkout funnel can be a delicate area to test on, or you might not get a ton of additional upside. So just walk backwards from there. Can you clean up your cart page? Can you remove a login gate? Can you improve the placement of your add to cart button, or the product name or price or subtext? The more steps between what you're testing and the final metric you're seeking to improve, the harder it will be to impact it. If you're trying to impact the sales of a certain category of products by increasing video plays on your homepage, well, there might be too loose of a relationship between that video and category sales for it to produce a meaningful difference. But if all you're trying to do is impact video play rate, well, now you've got yourself a good place to test. So as you think about where to test, and once you have a good list of things, the good candidates, it helps us to prioritize with this grid of velocity versus impact. So you can see the x-axis here is speed, and that's not just the speed of development, but in general, everything it's going to take to launch. It could be design, it could be permissions and approvals, what have you. And then on the y-axis is impact. And again, this doesn't necessarily need to be impact on revenue. It can be whatever impact means to your business. But naturally, you'll want to pick the items on your grid that are both high in velocity and high in potential impact. But when in doubt, give speed the edge. Especially early in a testing practice, it can be harder to gauge beforehand what is really going to have a huge impact. As we've both seen, small changes can lead to really big results, and vice versa. Huge changes can sometimes not net out the gains that you thought you would see. But if you can see that a test is going to be relatively simple and fast to run, you'll be able to test, get results, take action, and move on. As you progress, you'll learn more about what has more impact, and you'll be able to prioritize better and better and spot those. Another thing to consider is to have a combination of small, medium, and large tests in the pipeline, and this allows you to stay focused on big bets that could have a massive impact without losing momentum in the meantime. So you need to constantly be running tests. Now, once our tests are done, I prefer to use slides as opposed to a doc, but I had a very similar concept as Krista, where I try to cover everything a user needs to know about a test on a single slide. And the slide just dimensions itself. Those constraints make it easier for me to not keep going on and on about how the test did, but be concise and simple. These also include screenshots. They're easy to share. They're easy to slip into other slide decks. They gloss over a lot of the complexities, but hey, that's what an appendix is for. So this really, one of these gets produced for every single test that we run. I also have a testing dashboard or something shareable. This is a little bit more visual than I think what some might use. You don't necessarily need any fancy charts to describe the number of tests you're running per quarter. I do like to keep track of a test success rate, not because that needs to go up and to the right by any means, but because it's just good to know what percent of my tests are producing viable, statistically confident winners. And I like to keep myself honest. So we list every test. We are upfront about how it does, and that allows me to build credibility over time and, again, garner more resources and keep momentum. Other metrics that I like to look into and share are high-low estimates of annual incremental revenue impact when we are testing against revenue. And that number can be a little hard to pin down since, again, as Krista pointed out, some tests can cannibalize each other, and it can be hard to understand how tests build on each other. And also impact can erode over time, but that still gives a sense of relative scale of impact with a dollar value behind it, again, giving your team a little bit more room to move. And so, I thought I'd cap off my section with just some honest talk from someone who runs tests regularly. We're running at least a test a week over at Nest, oftentimes many more. And if you're moving at that speed, especially as your tests get more and more attention and more resources, you will inevitably encounter a pretty massive failure. Something that you've put a lot of eggs into, you're absolutely certain is going to win. You might have even waved the flag saying, hey, watch this test, it's going to be great. Not that this comes from deeply personal experience, but that's, and then have the test fail, of course. So that's okay. Hopefully your career didn't rest on that test. You really just have to be honest and transparent about these, and it can be more meaningful to large parts of the org if you fess up and say, it didn't work, we're not going to ship it. I'm glad we tested it rather than just shipping it, because then we wouldn't have known the negative impact on the business. And move on and incorporate that knowledge into future tests. You really can't just sweep losing tests under the rug, or your team will lose credibility and you'll have a harder time getting resources the next time. Also, you'll learn to stop being so confident about how you just absolutely know how tests will do, and you start to become more like a real scientist, testing rooted in genuine curiosity to see the results, not to have your biases confirmed. And if you're not honest about the outcomes of your failed tests, well, you might as well just ship what you wanted without testing anyway. So just to sum up what we've learned at Nest, we like to look at many tests over the course of quarters or a year and pick out trends that we've noticed, and so that we can start to filter this out as kind of a current truth for Nest designers and developers. So one example is having multiple calls to action on a page will generally split a user's attention, so pick one call to action. And then, again, we'll try to filter that into a lesson or a specific thing that a designer should do, which is, again, pick your primary action and design for that focus. And we are constantly, at least on a quarterly level, presenting on these aggregated lessons to large groups of people. So I'll hand things back to Krista now.
Thanks, Jesse. So to summarize what we've covered in this webinar today, with today's data-rich world, marketers are turning to data as a means to test and learn to improve the customer experience. A basic framework for the entire company that the entire company uses is critical to your success. And finally, be sure to learn from your past failures. I think both Jesse and I give you plenty of examples of those, and I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways today is test often, fail often, and learn from both. All right, so we've come to the end of our webinar. What questions do you have about how your company can be successful at testing? So to ask a question, type it into the Submit Question text area in your window, and we're going to go ahead now and turn it over to Q&A and look at some of those questions that you've had. So I see several questions that have been submitted along the lines of what we at Google have as a testing platform. So I'm really happy to say that we have a platform released last year called Google Optimize. There is Google Optimize 360 for our 360 customers, and there is a free version called Google Optimize. It is an awesome WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, testing tool, meaning you can drag and drop and easily design your variations in a visual editor. And it's pretty slick. I say that as maybe a little bit biased because I helped build it, but I do love it. I think it's a very great tool. And I see a few questions about when will this actually be available, the free version. So we are constantly working to get through that whitelist for sign up. I know many of you on the call have probably signed up or requested an invitation. I can't give you any exact dates, but I can say soon, hopefully. All right. So, Jesse, can you relay some stories on how you tested non-conversion flows that had a positive effect on customer experience? This question comes from Vince. So a lot of your examples were focused on conversions.
Yeah. Well, I'll give an example from support, and that's a really interesting place to test on because generally you want your metrics to go down on support. You want contact rates to go down. Often you want time on page or next page or other articles seen to go down because it indicates that they've not gotten their question answered. So it's an interesting place. But there's one specific example where we were trying to increase how often users expanded the right section of a rather long table of contents. And so you can enter an article because you have a specific question about Nest Aware, which is our subscription product, and there are many different places you could take these questions. And so we had kind of a longish table of contents with section after section after section. So we really wanted to dial in how quickly someone could get to an answer, and without driving up things like contact rates and other articles. So we did a few kind of UX treatments. One of them just kind of recategorized these these subtopics in a different way, gave you a quick way to kind of like expand down and expand back up the content rather than having to scroll a bunch and scroll back up. And sure enough, we saw higher engagement with the links. The time on page was lower, the next page usage was lower, contact rates was lower, and there was even a couple of call to actions based on what concern they had, and the usage of those calls to action went up, which implied to us that they were more able to find the answer to their question.
Great, yeah, a lot of good suggestions there for focusing on things outside of just conversion rate. So there is a question from Sonia. Is there a Google Analytics 360 that I can use as a teaching tool? Well, there is a Google Analytics demo account for the Google Merchandise Store that is publicly available. You and all of your students can go ahead and go in there and use a full e-commerce implementation of Google Analytics. It's a very robust account, and I'd highly recommend trying out some analysis techniques in there. A question from Arjun. How many instances or views can you run in Google Optimize? Well, that question depends on what version of Optimize you have, if you have Optimize or Optimize 360. In Google Optimize, the free version right now, you currently can have one container, which you would link to one view in Google Analytics. We'll see if that one container restriction continues to apply. In Google Optimize 360, you can link several containers, so you can test on many different views for your Google Analytics accounts. Okay. A question from Stein. This one's for you, Jesse. So he says, in my experience with developing a hypothesis, I regularly receive questions regarding the estimated benefit for a test. Since we are working with a hypothesis, this can be difficult. How do you go about answering the question and being as specific as possible?
Well, I generally like to do, again, I kind of mentioned t-shirt sizing for the impact of a variation. I will take the rate that I'm trying to move. Let's say it's the add to cart rate and the conversion rate for a product page. It's going to be, you have a 10% add to cart rate and a 5% conversion rate in some amazing store world that we don't own. So I'll look at that and I'll just say, okay, well, what's the chances that we can increase this by 25%, 50%, 100%, doubling that metric? And I'll just say, what's the annual incremental impact if we were to reach any one of those results? And how reasonable does it seem to reach those results? And if 25, 50, 100% works, then I'll go with that. If I don't think I can increase a metric more than 20%, then I'll do 5, 10, 20. And that kind of loose sizing gives me enough information for a business case. So I hope that answers your question.
Awesome. Question from Mason. How do you keep track of all your tests over time? Do you keep it in a spreadsheet or another tool? So I think Jesse and I both gave examples of this. I tend to use a spreadsheet that I keep information for all tests across different aspects such as timelines and prioritized tests and results and all that. And I like it as a Google spreadsheet because you can share that link out to everybody in your organization and they can always access it. Jesse mentioned a slide deck, which I think he does a very similar thing in. He has a template for every test and has all of the relevant information for each test within that slide. And I'm imagining that's also in Google Slides, so you can share that link out to your whole organization as well. Exactly. So I think those are a couple of great examples for how you can keep all of your tests organized.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily matter what you use as long as you have a very strong and consistent flow. I mean, I also personally use a spreadsheet for my own management, but the slides are for sharing. So as long as you dial in what the spreadsheet needs to do for you and stay consistent and document, you should be in a good place.
Totally agree. Jesse, a question for you from Kirill. Why do you recommend to focus on latter steps of the funnel?
Well, I think that point, and I might have been a little deceptive about showing just the checkout funnel, but that point was really to look at whatever funnel you're trying to impact and just make sure that you're close to the metal on that. You really want to go for if this, then that kind of tests without putting too much distance between what you really need to change. So, if I'm testing on a product page where you can add to cart, I do want the purchases to go up, but I might be more concerned about making sure the add to carts go up. Because if I can get more people to add to cart, I can probably get them more from the cart to checkout and then checkout to purchase. But if I'm, again, many steps removed, there are just so many possible ways that people can interact with your site that the effect of a change might have died down before you get to the final conversion point, whatever that might be.
Totally, and I think it also depends on how well that funnel tends to flow. So once you get people into a checkout process or into a sign-up flow, if you see that those rates, once they're in there, proceed pretty high, perhaps you do want to focus on the earlier stages of the funnel. But to Jesse's point, if there are many steps in between and there are a lot of things that can go wrong, I think that there are a lot of great places you can focus in the latter steps of that funnel. Jesse, how do you handle the difference in quality of acquired traffic over different periods of time? This question comes from Niels.
Well, so there are a number of testing theories that go behind this kinds of questions. Acquired traffic is just one type of variation you can see. With a good testing tool, you should be spreading any variation you should see evenly between the original or the control and the variation. And so let's say you're testing a metric that when you start the test has a 5% conversion rate and your variation is doing 20% better. Well, even if your quality of acquired traffic goes down and you go down to a 3% conversion rate, generally that 20% impact should be maintained even though the scale is much smaller. There's certainly a case to be made where it was only your really quality traffic that was doing well. You pull all that quality traffic back, and next thing you know, your test just isn't getting nearly enough conversions, in which case there's probably other things you should be looking to. But, this is similar to if mobile does worse than desktop and mobile receives a big push, then that should be distributed between the two variations evenly.
Great. A question from Gary. He wants to know, can you run two different tests on the same page? So I think that this definitely depends on the testing tool that you're using. In Google Optimize, the answer is yes. You can choose to run a test on only a certain percentage of your site, let's say 25%, which means that you have 75% of your traffic that you can still run other tests on, and Google Optimize will be sure that those don't overlap with the same users. I've worked with other tools that make sure that that's true, or maybe it's not true. So make sure that you understand how your testing tool runs.
Yeah, and really, if you're running them on the same page, that's basically a multivariate test, and you should just build them all into a single test where where each of the variations are there on their own and combined together. You're going to be much more satisfied with the results if you just build them all to a single test.
Yeah, I think that's true in a lot of cases, and potentially there's cases where it's not true. So I think you just need to understand the impact to your business and what you're trying to do with those multiple tests on the same page at the same time. Okay, let's look at a question from Leah. Do you have a recommended tool for doing a collaborative prioritization? I think this is pretty similar to our reporting discussion. I know I do it in Google Sheets, but Jesse, how do you guys do it?
Well, yeah, Google Sheets for sure. If you're talking about collaborative, it needs to be online in the first place. And one thing that I'll do is we'll have our entire pipeline, and we'll have a column for, again, t-shirt sizing of effort, high, medium, low, for design, for UX, for product or marketing if they need to be involved, and for analytics, potentially even for QA if we think that that's relevant. So after every team goes in and enters their t-shirt size for each of the tests, we can start to weight things and we can filter them in clever ways, and that should net us out some level of prioritization.
Jesse, another question for you from Benjamin. Can you talk a little more about coming up with a hypothesis for a test? How do you make sure it's simple and concise enough that everyone on the team will understand?
Well, I just like to think of these as tiny little stories that explain what a user is doing. So if I say that, our marketing pages are too long, they need to be shortened, people aren't making it all the way down, then what my insight would be, or the test parameters would be, let's shorten the page, and the hypothesis would be, well, by shortening the page, more people will engage with every piece of content rather than leaving off the pieces on the end. We will have trimmed the fat, so to speak, of things that may not matter as much, and therefore people will get more of our value propositions. And with all of those things, more of those people will will go to the store qualified, and hopefully, if we can get them to the store well qualified, we'll increase our conversion rate. So it's a little story that explains what I think is going to happen. If it's not true, then it means we need the sections or we cut out some critical sections. And our primary metric, getting to the store, is in there, and secondary metric, transactions of the product, is in there.
A couple quick questions here. One from Roman. How do you measure percentage confidence in your test? I think that this is generally done in the testing tool that you're using, and if your testing tool, such as Google Optimize, they do that out of the box for you with a probability to be the best. But if you don't have it built into a testing tool, you can always use some other programs. I know Jesse has a few that he likes. I tend to use like a student's t-test or something like that. But Jesse, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, so if your testing tool doesn't do it, if you're running a test that Optimize can't manage, like an email test, then I just look up statistical significance calculators. I have a couple of my own that I go to where you can do pre and post test analysis, and they should be giving you, they should allow you to say, do you need a 90 or 95% confidence level? And then once you enter in the results or enter in how you think it's going to do, it'll tell you whether you've reached that confidence level. It'll tell you things like power and p-value, which for statisticians out there are critical to knowing how valid your test is. But at the end of the day, if you just need, did I reach the confidence level, there are tons of calculators out there where it's pretty plug and play.
Great. So a test from Elon. Can the Google testing tool, so Optimize, be used to test on specific customer segments, or is testing randomized? That's a great question, and the answer is that it's always randomized, but if you have Google Analytics 360, you can actually test your Google Analytics audiences. So you can share an audience that you've created in Google Analytics, such as people who are frequent visitors and high-value converters. And then in Optimize, you can target that audience, and they have a 50-50 or however many variation percentage chance of getting approved into your test. So yes and no, but it's a really great option there to be able to personalize that experience more for the customers that you really care about. I think we are just about at time. And so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. Thank you guys for joining us today. Remember that you can view and listen to this presentation on demand using the same link that you used to attend. And the on-demand presentation should be available later this afternoon. Sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but I think we got through a lot of really good ones. And Jesse, I want to say thank you very much to you for joining us for this webinar today.
Thank you.